only a decent, not like super alcoholic. It's
Right,
just,
look. That's awesome. All right, I'm going to let folks in, and I'm just going to do a quick welcome, or just be more the logistics person, and then I think once we let folks in, I'm going to just give another minute or so for people to join, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and to Jennifer. So good luck. Thank you very much, all of you, for participating. It's been super, super awesome. So, and I will still be on the whole time, giving Jen and Sarah any feedback that I get, but also making sure, kind of being the bouncer, making sure that people unmuting and then their child is screaming and right next to their computer.
Corey, I have no on-screen roles, and I will turn off my video. I don't need to be seen, but I can also help you with the bouncer and handling the mutes and things like that if you want to give me co-host capability.
I love that, and I'm doing that right this moment.
Okay, great.
Awesome, thank you for that. That's huge. Okay, let folks in.
our kids are all Zooming from home, so we might be the ones you need to mute.
Same.
Excellent. All right, here we go. And again, off we go. Should be fun.
Wow.
What's going on, Jay? Oh, here, I'm going to close the door.
There's my mom.
Oh, crap.
Hey, hey everybody. Welcome to our Maine Bicentennial Chat, Cookbook Chat, brought to you by the Bangor Daily News and Maine Public. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, but I just want to go over some logistics. We're hoping everyone can remain muted throughout the event because we are recording it. But there also is the chat feature. We're really hoping that anyone who has any questions or curious about anything that comes up uses the chat. And then Jennifer Rooks and Sarah Karen, our hosts, will pull from them for some of the questions that come in. We also have a poll question where we are media and we're curious how you guys heard about this and kind of, are you BDN readers? Are you Maine Public listeners? Do you listen to Maine Calling with Jennifer Rooks? We're always so curious about those things. So if you have a chance, it's in the poll question. And so just have it, it's a quick little thing to do. So we'll probably get started in just about a minute. So appreciate everyone's patience and thanks for joining us today.
Now, how?
Would be helpful. Okay, well, again, welcome everybody. Why don't we get started? Again, if you have questions, we're really hoping we have a really vigorous chat session. And also we have made our poll live again about just kind of your media consumption, which is always good for us to know. And since I am not the front person, I will turn it over to those two people. So Jennifer and Sarah, take it away and thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Sarah, why don't you start?
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Sarah Walker-Karen. I'm senior editor for the Bangor Daily News. I am in charge of our Maine Life sections, which are Outdoors, Act Out, and Homestead. And in Homestead, we love talking about food and about cooking. Really excited to be here today. And I'm also a food writer. Jennifer, how about you?
I host a radio show called Maine Calling that's on from 11 to 12 every day. It's a statewide radio program. We were lucky enough to have Dawn and Carl and Margaret, as well, some of the submissions talk about this cookbook a few months ago when it first came out. So it's really fun to circle back and hear how everything is going, how the cookbook's been received, because it was just out, if I remember correctly, when we talked about it on the radio. And it's so fun to see all of you and hear about maybe recipes that you have made from that. I'm going to start by asking Carl, you and Margaret, to tell us the story. What is the genesis of this cookbook?
So hi everyone, I'm Carl Schatz, and
I'm Margaret Hathaway.
And we are the editors and compilers, and I guess creators of this wonderful collection of recipes from people all over Maine. And it started a little over probably a year and a half ago when I saw a friend posted on Facebook a picture of a sesquicentennial cookbook. And I reached out to the Bicentennial Commission and asked if anyone was putting together a bicentennial cookbook, and no one was. And they sort of said, that would be great if you did it. And so we set out to do just that. And we reached out to Dawn Lindgren, who's a friend of ours and the owner of Rabelais Books in Biddeford, because he's kind of the cookbook expert that we know. And we sort of went to him and said, we have this idea for a bicentennial cookbook, and we wanted to include recipes from people all over Maine and some recipes from well-known Mainers and maybe some historical recipes. And we want $2 from every book, or some amount of money from every book sold, to go to benefit the fight against hunger here in Maine. And he said to us, well, it sounds like you are putting together a community cookbook. And we didn't at the time really know much about community cookbooks as a genre, but he really educated us about what the community cookbook was and their really rich history here in the state. And Dawn, maybe you want to say a few words just about community cookbooks in general.
Sure. And hello, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this. I do. So this is the sesquicentennial book that Carl was just referring to, he described to me, or the two of them, Margaret and Carl, described to me something that was really familiar to me, because it's a project I've been working on for a long time. I've been collecting Maine cookbooks personally, not as part of my business, for over 10 years. And I have almost 800 books that were produced in the state of Maine, most of which are community cookbooks. And so there's a definition of community cookbook. It's produced by a recognizable community. And by community, I'm not talking about a place like a town, but rather a group, an organization, a social organization. It might be a church auxiliary, a ladies auxiliary, for a Grange Hall or a hospital. There are just hundreds of different types of organizations it could be. So that's the first. The second aspect is that the recipes are compiled or brought together by the community group itself. And the third is that the book has some sort of fundraising charitable component that's going to either help the organization it's a part of, like the church, or something out in the community. And that's exactly what Carl and Margaret were describing to me. So if you look at the very first Maine cookbook, which is just a brown rectangle here, the very first Maine cookbook was produced in Portland in 1877, and it's got all three of those things. It's the ladies auxiliary of the State Street Parish. It's the recipes come from the women in the group, and they were raising money with the sale of the book in order to actually fix the steeple of the church that had been struck by lightning. So that's the three elements there. And with the Maine Community Cookbook, it's a different community. The community is the entire state of Maine. The recipes are drawn from within the community, and there's a charitable aspect with some of the proceeds going to a wide variety of food security charities in the state of Maine. So that's how these books fit together. This brand new book is part of a long tradition in the state of Maine, and it's a neat tradition.
Community cookbooks have a way of capturing something about the community, kind of like the soul of the community. What stands out to you about this particular recipe collection?
Well, you're absolutely right. These community cookbooks tend to be a sort of snapshot of a moment in time. And this book, the Maine Bicentennial Community Cookbook, is no different. It's a snapshot in time. The time happens to be the bicentennial celebration of statehood. But in a way, the snapshot is so much bigger than even the bicentennial, because it reflects all sorts of people that are within the current community of Maine. So this includes Mainers who have been here for many, many, many generations, whose traditions are very much what we think of with historical or traditional Maine food. And it includes people who are very new Mainers who are just arriving and bringing their new food traditions into the state of Maine. It includes people who have a very traditional outlook. It has people who are very sort of contemporary and modern in their approach to food. So there's like a really, really wide range of people, but that's what Maine is at this moment. And that's where it gives us that really nice soul of the state, even though the soul of the state is so varied and rich in different types of traditions.
Carl, Margaret, I want to send a question to you. When you started gathering the questions for this, or gathering, excuse me, the submissions for this, were there any types of recipes you saw a lot more of than others?
Go ahead.
Yeah, there were some. There were a lot of venison mincemeat recipes, a lot of molasses cookies. You know, we were gathering recipes around the holidays, November, December, January of last year. And so a lot of it was sort of what you think of as festive holiday kind of food. I'm trying to think, are there others that we got a lot of in the savory categories? We got enough bean recipes that we actually just made a whole chapter, because
same with donuts.
And same with donuts,
Yeah.
because things were just a little bit different in each one. So we just gave the whole area.
Yeah, and I think just thinking about, you know, foods that are important to our state, I think donuts
sort of iconically.
Iconically. I mean, I think donuts maybe more currently, but beans certainly.
The donut was invented in Camden.
Well, there you go.
It has historical roots here.
But we received just lots and lots of stories with the bean recipes about how this was what, you know, their family ate every Saturday night. Like every Saturday night it was beans and some combination of other
Riley water, mustard pickles.
Yeah, some combination of other things, but it just felt like beans was such an important family food throughout many of the stories we received that it really deserved its own chapter.
Which ended up, given what people were cooking during the pandemic, it was sort of prescient that we focus so much on beans.
Beans and donuts. Sarah.
So you received hundreds and hundreds of recipe submissions. How did you narrow it down to just 200, or about 200? I think it's a little over 200.
Yeah, it's 200 if you don't count. So.
Yeah. So one of the things we did once we'd received all the recipes was we got together a group of food writers and cookbook editors here in the state and gathered pre-pandemic, gathered at Rabelais and had a little powwow where we printed out all the recipes. Margaret had done kind of a first pass and then narrowed it somewhat, and we sat down with probably 250 or 300 recipes and just on sheets of paper and passed them around to everyone and we'd sorted them into some different categories, and people kind of just went through and made some notes. And that was a really helpful process for us to get that kind of input from other Maine food writers and editors.
But in addition to the recipes, people sent us these stories and intimate looks into their lives. They sent us unfinished manuscripts of memoirs, all kinds of family photos. And so pretty early on, it became clear that we would have to include a much more narrative than simply just recipes. And so some of the criteria for including recipes also came from what the stories were that went along with them. We made sure that nothing was uncookable. Everything had to have clear instructions, all the ingredients listed, but there were a few things that we we chose to put in because they really had just wonderful stories that went with them too.
Don Lindgren, you've looked at so many cookbooks, historic cookbooks in your day. I'm wondering what a cookbook says about the people who participate in it, especially community cookbook, and also about the time in which it's. Have you noticed some trends as you look at cookbooks and see when they're published, and then look at what was maybe going on in history or in the state of Maine?
Sure. There's so many different things that cookbooks can tell us. The first thing we think of has to do with the food, and of course the recipes, they indicate various food trends. They indicate different types of items that were newly available that may not have been available before. You can see certain types of social trends in the food where people are very much interested in entertaining at certain moments, where holiday things become bigger at certain moments than others. But the community cookbooks in particular have lots of other things they tell us as well. Most of the community cookbooks include advertising from the local communities, so we can get a snapshot of what Presque Isle or Bangor or Berwick may have looked like on their main street. What kinds of businesses were there? How were they talking to each other about what they did? Because those are the people who were helping to fund the production of the cookbook, and this is what this is where they put their ads. You also get a sense, if you look at these books closely, of exactly what the predominantly women who were producing these books, what they wanted their communities to be, and how they reached out to each other, formed these groups, did the work of producing a cookbook in order to make the community better in some way, to build a library, to build a hospital, to make a larger Grange Hall for community meetings. And without going into exactly how it works, they produced a tremendous amount of money to build these things that still exist in small towns, in our villages and small towns in Maine, but across America. They had a huge impact on the types of buildings we see in our small downtown areas and on the village greens.
This question is for all of you. You've mentioned the stories and pictures that came with the submissions. Were there stories that stood out to you as you were going through the submissions, and what were they?
Well, I think early on we got, one of the stories, and I hope she's on this in the group somewhere. It's hard, there are a lot of people, so it's hard to find people, but we got a submission from Jane Faron, who I believe now lives in Presque Isle, but about her family. And she is, her mother was one of 5 Foss girls of Harmony, Maine. And she sent this story about the 5 Foss girls. And I think they lost their mother early on and were raised by their father. And her aunt, who has a recipe in the book, and Jane has a recipe of her father's in the book, but she sent us a sort of several stories and essays that her aunt Edda Foss Cobb had written, talking about their lives growing up in Harmony, with very little food at times. There's a little story in the section on preserves and pickles called "I Wish I Had a Hot Dog," which is a story about how she and her sister, about 2 of the sisters, were wishing they had a hot dog, and they wrapped a pickle in a roll of bread and pretended it was a hot dog. And just like there were a number of stories that we received like that really had an impact on us, and especially as we moved to the final editing stages of the book, when at that point it was March and April and the pandemic had started, and food was seeming to become scarce. You couldn't find flour in the grocery store. There were certain staples that were just disappearing from the shelves. And to be reading these stories about how families got through these hard times at the early part of the century was both very relevant, but also somewhat encouraging to know that they got through, you know, that this was something that people have struggled with through Maine's history of food security, and somehow they made it through, always putting a silver lining around that cloud, pretending a pickle is a hot dog, or I'm trying to think what some of the other stories like that were, but it was really meaningful for us to be on the receiving end of stories like that.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of mornings that, you know, we opened our email and just like started the day in tears because these were so heartfelt. And you ask if there are favorites or ones that stick out, and I think they're all in there. I can't distill it down.
Yeah.
Although the Foss sisters was really, there were some that didn't make it into the book, but I wish we could have included all of their family stories.
Yeah.
Well, Carl, I'm so glad you brought up Jane, because I'm pretty certain Jane's with us. Jane, are you, I see you. If you can unmute, why don't you tell, for those who haven't read the cookbook, the story of your dad's whole beans?
Well, my dad, my mother did most of the cooking, and my dad would make these beans in the backyard in Harmony, Maine, in the village, and he would get all sorts of praise. Everybody loved his beans, and Mom would be in the house slaving away, doing everything else just as normal, and Dad would get all the praise for his beans. So it was,
You know,
one of the pleasures.
I moved to Maine in 1994, and I'd never heard of whole beans. So if there's anyone else here on the call who doesn't know what that is, tell us what a whole bean is.
Well, he would have a hole in the backyard, and he'd build a fire in the hole, and he would put the pot of beans. You had to have a lid. He describes the cover that you need over the pot, a lid to go on the outside, and you put it down in the coals, and you leave it there for 12 hours, and you got your beans. And to be very honest, I did 3 family cookbooks about the Foss family, and so I had my dad's whole bean recipe in one of the cookbooks. So it was very easy to submit it to Carl for the book.
And have you had much of a response since your cookbook came out, your recipe came out in this cookbook? Have people reached out to you?
Well, of course, the family, my cousins, all excited. I have heard from Aroostook County people, because I live up in Aroostook County in Presque Isle. So they would look for my name, and they see my name under Aroostook County, because that's where I live, but my dad is Harmony, Maine. It's been very positive. Hopefully got
Thank
a couple
you.
cousins on here today. We'll see.
Don, we missed you. Did you have any stories that really stuck out to you in the process?
Well, I'd simply say that I received some of the mail submissions at the shop, because some people would send them there, other people through the website, and others would send mail submissions to Carl and Margaret directly. And when I started getting the mail submissions, I found it really moving, because I'm somebody who's studied cookbooks and community cookbooks in particular for a long time, but I've never been part of the process. And the idea that suddenly I was part of this process of people sharing this personal thing, and I think of food as a very important and intimate part of life, and one that has so many meanings. And then here I am receiving these things in the mail and opening them up and finding these very personal stories of what food meant to the people who were sending them. So it wasn't so much that there was an individual story that stood out, but that the somewhat kind of cold academic view that I take towards books, which people know that that's the case, that all of a sudden it was much more personal, and it was a real pleasure and frankly a kind of an honor to be part of this very old historical tradition, and then an honor to be making something new with it, with this brand new book. So I love being part of that process of compilation and all of the different kinds of decisions and choices that Carl and Margaret had to make, and with a larger group of people consulted. all of that stuff was really interesting because suddenly it was just like the group of people who would have gathered to produce any of these books in the 1870s or the 1930s or today.
Mm. I'm looking through the questions here, and Vera wants to know if there's a pickle section to the cookbook. Carl and Margaret, how many pickle recipe submissions did you get, and how did you tell us about the pickles that made it?
Yeah, so there is a section called it's called preserves, and it includes pickles and it includes some other types of preserves, like relish. There's a pepper relish. There's a hot dog relish. That's actually a really, I think, interesting story about a recipe called Edda's hot dog relish, which came to us from here. I want to make sure it's right here, from Carol McIntyre Edwards from Harrison. And she had sent in this recipe along with a really wonderful family picture. And we had another recipe that Dawn had given us from a historic cookbook from the turn of the century. And this is from her, I think her grandmother or great grandmother around the same time period.
And her grandmother had not referred to it as chow chow.
She called it a hot dog relish.
Yeah. But in this historic recipe, there was a recipe for chow chow that was exactly the same as this recipe for Edda's hot dog relish. It was 1 peck of green tomatoes, a cabbage, going on, except they had changed in the Edda Prep McIntyre's recipe, they had changed the amount of turmeric, but just slightly, but clearly just changing a recipe to their family's taste. And so we ended up not putting in the historic chow chow recipe because it would have been just a duplication. Been the same.
But one of the things that we saw happen was people submitting family recipes to us that had come to their family through other community cookbooks, from previous community cookbooks, that these community cookbooks, were circulated and received and become part of family cooking, traditions, and then the recipes from those cookbooks become their family traditions, and they submitted them to us as their family recipe because they might have changed it in some way. We received one visual that didn't make it into the book that I really wish we had found a place for. It was someone sent us a picture it was a venison mincemeat recipe that's in the book, but the picture she sent us was of the page from the community cookbook that she cooks from, with all of her changes on it. She crossed off this ingredient, changed this, something in the instructions she changed, and all the changes that she made to make the recipe her own. And we saw that again and again with the impact that previous community cookbooks had on the recipes that we received for this book.
There's a lot of interest in your collection of community cookbooks. Vera and Mary are wondering if you have a database of all the community cookbooks that you've collected.
I do, but it's still not ready for prime time. I'm happy to talk with people directly. If they want to send me an email or a text, they can get me at don@rabelaisbooks.com. And I'm happy to answer questions. It usually takes me a bit to dig some of those books out, especially now during pandemic time, because I've got like half of my stuff that is at the shop and half of it's here. I have 100 boxes of books in my house right now, which is about 90 too many. But so it's being done. I'm working on doing a full bibliography of Maine cookery. It's got to have a stop date because, of course, Maine keeps producing more and more great cookbooks every year. But I've been working on that for a long time. But if somebody wants to ask me about a book or about a town or about an organization and whether I'm aware that that organization produced a book or ask me if they did produce a book, I'm happy to let them know as much as I do know.
Here's a question from Rick to everyone. Have the recipes been modernized? Many old recipes use ingredients that are known by different names than those we know today and can't even find today in a modern supermarket. Don, you know more than anyone how some of the ingredients are different. Wondering, we'll ask you first, Don, and Carl and Margaret, you can talk about finding recipes that really wouldn't be so easy to find the ingredients today?
Well, I'll start by answering there are 20 historical recipes in the book. All of the rest of the recipes in the book were submitted by people in Maine today, although some of those recipes look back a bit. Of the 20 historical recipes, no, they're exactly the way they appeared in the cookbooks they were drawn from, and that was a very conscious decision. We wanted them to reflect their time. I don't think there are things in the book that the ingredients are hard to find, generally speaking, throughout the whole book. I think it was much harder to find certain ingredients 25 years ago than it is today. I think we're all lucky to have a fantastic food culture in Maine that means that we have a really wide range of things available at most supermarkets, and then there are all sorts of great specialty markets that supply stuff. In terms of the way the recipes, the submitted recipes work, though, I turn to Margaret and Carl to answer that one.
Yeah, I think there are a few things that are a little harder to find, but not impossible. Salt cod is something that, you know, you have to seek that out. It's not in every market. Where things were like sort of archaic, like oleo, we just put a substitution in parentheses. So we tried to honor the recipe as it had been submitted, but also make it cookable for people now.
And I would add one thing to that, which is that one of the decisions that Carl and Margaret made about the form of the recipes is that the language wouldn't be standardized, that there were certain things that were fixed or adjusted, but that the way people submitted the recipe, the general format, the way they put information together, or the types of sentences they used, that was kept the way it was sent in, largely because the idea was to reflect their language, not the language of Carl and Margaret and Don and anybody else that's in that group that was looking at them, so that it would be true to the submitters and to their family traditions, and not just to some concept of how a cookbook should be structured.
Yeah.
I thought that was a great choice and a very personal one for the submitters.
Yeah, thanks, Don. We really tried to keep the recipes a little standardized, like all the ingredients are listed in the order that they're used and things like that to help with cookability. But as Don says, to keep the narrative particularly in the voice of the family submitting the recipe.
And even the recipe instructions as much as possible to keep that in the voice of the person who was giving those instructions.
Sarah?
Right. Sure. I want to remind everybody who's tuning in that you can ask questions in the chat and we will ask them for you so you can get them answered. Marcy commented that beanhole beans are iconic Maine fare, where she lives in Burlington, Lincoln, Enfield area. They're often used for fundraisers for families in need. What other iconic foods do you have in the cookbook? What else is there?
Well, Whoopie Pies. There's a Whoopie Pie recipe that was submitted to us by, and we actually got a number of Whoopie Pie recipes, but Amos Orcutt, who was part of the University of Maine, sent us what turns out to be his wife's Whoopie Pie recipe, but along with it, the official proclamation naming the Whoopie Pie to be the official Maine state treat.
Yes.
And so we included his Whoopie Pie recipe. He was, I think, at the forefront of getting that proclamation made. But there's a really wonderful story called, I think it's called Mom's Special Whoopie Pies or something.
I think so. I think that's
about
what it is,
there's this little story. We didn't include that recipe in the book, although we did do we had some extra recipes left over at the end of all this, and we created a set of recipe cards, and that Whoopie Pie recipe is on the recipe cards. But just about growing up, I believe it was growing up
special Whoopie Pies.
Yeah, growing up in Aroostook County, and how they would go out, the children would go out picking potatoes, and the mom always in their lunches always made whoopie pies and wrapped it in wax paper and sent it with them. And those kinds of details that were in these stories just was really, you know, a reminder to us about how food really connects us not only to the people in our past, but to the places in our past, and reminds us about growing up. And there were so many stories about how this certain food reminded someone of their grandmother's kitchen or their grandfather's farm, or, you know, their sisters or brothers growing up. And those kinds of memories were are just really powerful and tied to flavor and food as much as memory.
Celine Terrian would like to know, do you have French Canadian recipes in the book? And I know that the answer is yes, because I just flipped open to the Sicard family tourtière.
Yeah, there are a number. There's a recipe for ploys.
Yeah, there's gratin from Chad Conley's grandmother. There are several French Canadian recipes. There's a chicken stew with dumplings.
Yeah, an Acadian chicken stew.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. It wouldn't be a Maine cookbook without some French Canadian flavor.
And I'd point out that I'm always looking for more community cookbooks and other cookbooks that were produced by French Canadians in Maine. There are a few in the collection, but I really feel like there should be many more than what I've seen so far. And I've been looking for a good while, but I've only got a handful, but they're great.
Judy asks, were there any recipes that gave no temperature for baking, but used only a hot oven or medium oven because the baking was done in a wood stove?
Yes, there are a number of recipes that don't specify a temperature, and we've received a couple of emails to our website from people wondering what temperature they're supposed to set their oven at, and is this a mistake in the book that we left out the temperature? And we don't see it as a mistake. We see it as an opportunity for the home cook to decide what their best temperature should be for whatever it is they're baking or cooking. But
that said, when we could get in touch with someone and ask them, does a hot oven mean 375 to 400 to you? We tried to put a parenthetical instructions.
But there are definitely recipes there
are a couple that we left as is.
Yeah,
so.
And where people talk about the fact that this was made in, you know, on a wood cooking stove that was, you know, that was what their grandmother had in the kitchen growing up, was a wood-fired cook stove.
Carl and Margaret, I know that you are as familiar with the recipes as anyone, but you're still taking part in the Dash of Maine Holiday Cooking Challenge and still making these recipes. What have you made recently?
Well, yesterday I made the holiday cranberry pudding with a delicious hard sauce that we were going to have for our lunch dessert. That's wonderful.
Our lunch dessert, I love it.
We made everything that the Dash of Maine has done. So we've been week by week cooking along with everyone, which has been so much fun.
And we've been posting. So we have an Instagram account for the Bicentennial Cookbook, and we've been posting pictures of the submissions that were sent in, the winning drawing submissions. And our own dish that we made for that week. So I think we've got last week's was the yellow-eyed beans, which were delicious, from Martha Hadley of I think she lives in Ohio now, but she grew up in Aroostook County. And
the week before that, the week of Thanksgiving, it was boiled dinner, which was great because then we
got to do two recipes.
Yeah. Then we made it for hash on Thanksgiving morning, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
So
we've been cooking right along with the challenge, and it's been a lot of fun seeing you know, how other recipes are turning out from the book by other people. And it's also interesting because we made a very conscious decision early on not to include any pictures of food in the book. So it's an unusual cookbook in the fact that there are actually no pictures of food. I think the only picture of food, actually, we do have there's an ad,
yeah.
or maybe 2 ads that include pictures of pie from Wyman's and from Stonewall Kitchen. But other than that, there are no pictures that go with the recipes of food. And we felt it was important that people not feel like their dish was supposed to look like anything specific. We're so, I think, bombarded these days with such beautiful pictures of food through Instagram, through social media, and just the number of incredibly beautifully photographed cookbooks that we're inundated with. But that can, for home cooks, that could be and feel intimidating, or feel, like the way they made the food didn't live up to what they're seeing in the book. And we just wanted people to know that the most important thing about the recipes in this book are not what they look like, but how they taste and who they are sharing them with. So there are no pictures of food in the book, but it's been great to see people submitting their pictures of the recipes as they've been making them.
And what's funny, one of our family's absolute favorite dishes from the book is claptrap, which is a mash of rutabaga, carrot, and potatoes, and a whole lot of cream. And it would not be
photographed.
It would not be a beautiful photograph.
There's no way to photograph that beautifully, but it tastes delicious.
It tastes amazing. Yeah. And we have 3 kids with very different preferences for food. And yet that is something we can all agree on.
They all love claptrap.
Yeah, claptrap is amazing. So.
I hear that Jane Cleves McKenna, who's one of the submitters, is on right now. Jane, if you want to unmute, I'd love to hear about your experience of submitting and what it's been like to have your recipe in this book.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. And thanks for putting this on. I think it's a really great topic to be talking about. I heard about the cookbook around Thanksgiving last year and submitted a couple of recipes, and they chose my rhubarb custard pie. And it's pies in my family. My mother's made pies almost every week, so it was the first springtime fruit pie that our family would have, and it's just a really wonderful and easy pie to make.
If I can
Great,
just
sounds
say,
wonderful.
Yeah, I think the thing that really got us about Jane's recipe and the story behind it, it feels like a quintessential Maine story where someone, I can't remember, she either, what was the story? You didn't have rhubarb, or someone else didn't have rhubarb, and they gave you some rhubarb.
Yeah, I had just,
yeah.
Excuse me. I just bought my first house in Bodenham, where I still live, and I was working at L.L. Bean, and one of the older gentlemen there, Justin Williams, who actually lived right behind the store, and his house is still there. We were talking about rhubarb, and he said, "Oh, well, I'll give you some of my plants." And so I showed up at his house later that afternoon, and he had dug out all of the roots and was very specific as to how to plant them and how to maintain the rhubarb patch. And I did it, and I've moved several times since I created that first patch, and I take my rhubarb with me from house to house because I just can't not have a rhubarb patch.
It doesn't get any more Maine than that right there.
Well, and I have to say, just as a recipe, to have a top crust on a rhubarb custard pie was something I had never done before, and I will never go back. Your pie is amazing. I love it.
And it's a custard pie without
dairy too,
which is really
well, there's butter, but
no milk,
no milk
cream,
in it. It was such a wonderful recipe. We love it.
Thank
we
you.
made it a lot this summer.
Yeah.
We have 10 rhubarb plants, so we were making this a lot.
Great.
Oh no, our
Here,
phone's ringing.
is Lisa Millimet with us, one of the submitters? Are you here, Lisa? It's hard to tell. There are 4 pages of us. Yes, no? Darn, I was hoping that somebody else who had submitted a recipe and had it.
I am here.
Oh, there
Oh,
she
good. There you are. Yay. Lisa, tell us the story of your recipe that you submitted, or
Oh.
recipe.
Well, my recipe is probably the most minimalist recipe, and I don't think that the story I don't think it got into the book because of the recipe.
Well, tell us.
Well, it's shrimp wiggle.
from the
Which-
1940s. That we love the title.
Yeah, from the 1940s. And it's basically tomato soup and shrimp. Tomato soup from a can. But it comes from a remarkable history and a remarkable family and my wonderful grandmother, Lulu Augusta Gray. And
Well, tell us about her.
Well, okay, so when she was a little girl, both of her parents were from Nova Scotia, and which is probably why she kept like a homing pigeon coming to Damascotta. I was thinking of the name Damascotta, Nova Scotia. She used to come. She did not live in Maine. She lived in Massachusetts, but when she was 3 years old, her father died. And her mother couldn't take care of the 3 children, so she sent them to the farm in Nova Scotia. And one day when my grandmother was sent out to the field to bring the haying men in for lunch, or dinner as it was called, she ran right into the scythe. And she couldn't see the scythe, the grass was tall. And it practically cut her leg off. And they took her into the old cable Nova Scotia house and put a piece of leather in her mouth and tied her to the bed and sewed it back on. And that pretty much tells you who my grandmother was. And she, Elizabeth O'Brien, her mother sent for the children. And on her wedding night to Donnie Ferguson, they let little Lulu sleep between them, because she was hanging on so tight to her mother. So that was my grandmother. And she became, of course, the center of the family, and her kitchen was always humming and bubbling. And she had a really old ice box with the thing on the top that kept it going. And there was always a lot of New England food. I mean, I dug out of her, we have oyster stew, scalloped oysters, codfish cakes, codfish souffle, and she lived a little bit inland. However, she just had that ocean in her blood, I think, from Nova Scotia. And raisin pie and blueberry charlotte and apple snow and all these things. And my mother remembers that her mother continued the boarding house, Lulu's mother. And when my mother was a little girl, she couldn't see the goodies up on the counter, but she would reach along the edge with her fingers and dip them into the cakes and pies. So those are the stories, a little bit of that gang. And
just an example of how a recipe is so much more than a recipe.
Yeah, I just want to say to Carl and Margaret, I'm just so thrilled that you put their story in. And I have another picture of her here. Here's Lulu.
Oh, beautiful.
Wow. That's amazing.
And I just have to show you the dashing man she chased down and became the first woman in the town of Attleboro to get her driver's license to get this man.
He is dashing.
You can see why he was 100% French. So thank you so much for putting her in.
Oh, thank you for sending us your story and your recipe. We love including it.
Sharing your family with us.
Margaret and Don and Carl, so you have had some exciting things happening recently with regards to the cookbook. You're in the 4th printing, which is pretty amazing. And you had some news last night, I think, right?
Yeah, some very exciting news. We entered the book in the Readable Feast New England cookbook competition, and we found out last night that we were honored in 3 different categories. We were runner-up in the People's Choice category, and then also runner-up for both New England Cookbook of the Year and their sort of bigger Cookbook of the Year category. So we were runner-up in three different categories, which was really exciting for us, and I think really speaks to the to the power of these family stories and family recipes, and to the importance that community cookbooks have played in Maine's food history, and as I think Dawn would point out, in our country's food history.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is it's great that this book sits in this tradition and is getting honored, just with programs like this, which is fantastic. And I'm now trying to figure out how I'm going to save this chat conversation, because there's so much great stuff people are mentioning in there. But that this is a long personal part of cookbook history, a long community tradition, a tradition of generosity. And Carl and Margaret haven't talked about the fundraising aspect of it at all. I think that's worthy of a mention. And it's great that the tradition still continues in a world which is increasingly digital. This is something that's still tangible, and the handing around of recipes, the sharing of recipes, all of that stuff, whether it takes place on email or in a chat conversation or through the mail with real photographs and stuff like that, it's all sharing, and that's what's really terrific about this project.
Yeah.
Well, Don, that was a great way to wrap it up. And thank you, all of you, for joining us for this. And Carl and Margaret and Don, congratulations, and happy holidays to everyone.
Happy holidays.
Thank you very much.
you.
Happy holidays to
Happy
everyone.
holidays to everyone.
Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you
Yeah.
all.
Thank you.
Thank you.